Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Sexual Assault Survivor Stories, the SAS podcast. Thank you for being here. This powerful podcast offers inspiration, education, and guidance on healing from emotional and mental trauma, providing a safe space for victims and survivors of rape or sexual assault to share their experiences and promoting trauma-informed care with belief, support, and empathy. I'm your host, Dave Markel, coming to you from the Long Valley Studio in Washington, Utah. This is episode 122, and my guest this week is Rosa. Rosa has a letter she wants actor John Stamos to hear. If you know John or know someone who knows him, please have him listen to this episode. But this letter is not only for John Stamos, it's significant for everyone to hear, as is the rest of Rosa's story. And she also has a message for the lawmakers of the state of Connecticut. But like the letter, this message is for lawmakers in every state. Have a listen and you'll understand what I mean. This is important. So let's get to it, and I'll catch you on the other side. Here's Rosa. Rosa, thanks for being here on Sexual Assault Survivor Stories. I'm really honored that you've joined me today.
Thank you so much for having me, Dave. I'm really glad to be here.
You bet. And just for some background, Rosa reached out to me. We started talking. We've texted back and forth. We've had a phone conversation prior to this recording. And I really felt that Rosa's story was something that we needed to talk about and get out there. So it's an honor to have you. I appreciate your strength and your fortitude in being here, Rosa.
Thank you so much.
Let's just dive right into it. Rosa, what are you able to tell us about your experience?
So I was sexually assaulted when I was 15 years old. I'm 34 right now, so I'm actually, oddly enough, the same age that the perpetrator was when he sexually assaulted me. When I was 15 years old, my parents dropped the charges against the perpetrator, and unfortunately, I didn't have a say in it because I was a minor and I was under 18. But the statute of limitations where I live in Connecticut is 48 years old. So for 18 years, I wanted to press charges, and I finally got the courage to do so in late 2023. And I wanted to talk a little bit more about that.
Absolutely.
What gave me the final push is a little bit unique, so I want to share that. John Stamos wrote a book called If You Would Have Told Me, and I'm a really big Full House fan. So I was watching that show since I was young, all the way up until now. I still watch it on reruns, and I watched Fuller House, the remake. And he posted a video right before his book came out because in his book, he talks about a sexual assault. And the video was extremely powerful. And he talks about how it still impacts him to this day. He's also a childhood sexual abuse victim. And he talked about how it still affects him to this day at 60 years old. And that to me was very powerful and very validating that someone in their 60s is still affected by something that happened in their childhood. And I also didn't want to be 60 years old myself and regret not doing this because I only have until I'm 48. I wrote him a letter to thank him, and I love to start by reading that out loud.
Yeah,
okay.
Please.
So his book is called If You Would Have Told Me. If you would have told me back in 2005, when I was just 15 years old, that John Stamos would write a book and make a viral video that would push me to take an important step in my life, I never would have believed you. John Stamos, you and I have so much in common. We are both diehard Disney fans and also childhood sexual assault victims. As you recently mentioned at the D23 event, Disney fills us with a relentless belief that our dreams have no expiration date. No one should ever have to dream of getting justice or closure from a childhood sexual assault. Unfortunately, it happens to so many of us, including you and me. Like you, there was also a time in my life where I didn't want to kill myself, but also didn't care if I died. And also like you, I'm so glad I didn't die. The best years of my life hadn't happened yet. I'm grateful that God gave us both many more beautiful years to experience. And I wish us both many healthy years filled with unexplainable joy, better than we could ever imagine. I was only 15 years old when my parents dropped the childhood sexual assault charges against the perpetrator. I had no say because I was a minor. For the longest time, I felt like I didn't belong in the world. I felt alone and unsupported by those who should have supported me the most. I felt angry. During those years, one of the few ways I found laughter, relief, and joy was by watching Full House reruns. You made me laugh back then when it was nearly impossible to do so. 6 years later, I began to rebuild my life little by little. Each year, I continue to experience more joy than the last. Your book and video gave me the final courage to reopen the case and press charges against the perpetrator. I hope that one day I can hug you and thank you in person. But until then, I hope this reaches you so that you know just how much you helped me. Your video was the one missing piece I needed to take that final step for justice. I have so much love and respect for you, John. Thank you for speaking out. I hope my story helps someone like yours helped me.
A great letter.
Thank you.
What became of that letter? Did you ever have the opportunity to send it off to John?
Unfortunately, I didn't send it yet because I was not able to get complete justice yet. And I'll talk more about the legal process here and some things I'm working on changing. But no, I didn't publish it yet or send it to him. So I'm hoping that he will hear it on this podcast.
That would be great. I'll do what I can to send that out there to some people I know that might have access to him and get him to listen to this. That would be great.
Thank you. Yes, I decided to read it because I'm not 100% sure if I ever will get full justice, but we're working on some things.
Let me go back just a bit. Tell us more about that process in the beginning. After you were sexually assaulted, you said you weren't able to get justice then because your parents dropped the charges. How did those charges come about in the first place? How did an investigation ensue?
I had wanted to talk to a counselor and my parents agreed and they thought everything was confidential, but I guess if you're under 18, it is not. Sexual assault counseling is confidential if you're 18 or older, but because I was 15 and it was a family member, they were required to call DCF. So that what resulted in the DCF call and the police investigation.
Do you remember much about that investigation? Do you feel like a thorough investigation was conducted?
I don't think it was very thorough at all. I think because they knew my parents were going to drop the charges, they did a very basic, minimal investigation. A little bit was discovered, but not a ton. And even if it was more, my parents were planning on dropping it anyways. I did reopen the case in 2023. This was back in 2005. And a lot of people told me when I reopened it that if this happened today, the way DCF works and after the Me Too movement and all that, that even if my parents had wanted to drop the charges, it's super unlikely that the local police and DCF would not have allowed it.
Right. That makes sense. I'm wondering if DCF had any type of recommendations, though. Were you protected at all as a result of the disclosure? Did anything ensue that put you in a situation where you were, number one, believed, and number two, were there some restrictions or protections put in place?
They told us that we could apply for a restraining order, but my parents didn't think that was necessary either because we agreed just to never see each other again, and we didn't, and they knew that that was going to be the case. I wasn't super worried about that.
And was that the case then, that there was no more contact after that?
Right, there was no more.
What was the impact? How did that affect you? And what occurred in your life after that sexual assault occurred?
It affected me a lot more than I ever thought it would. I had a lot of PTSD from that. I had some night terrors, which lasted a little over 2 years, about 26 months. I think part of what was so traumatic was not even just, it was definitely traumatic to have the assault happen, but also losing contact with so many family members and not being protected or supported. I thought that they would all really have a lot of empathy towards me, but instead they were so much more concerned about protecting the perpetrator. I guess that happens often because I've heard so many more stories since then, and it's really, really concerning.
It's part of why this podcast exists. With my background in education and everything I've learned since becoming an advocate and an instructor in these types of investigations, it's obvious that we live in a rape culture. We live in a situation where, like you said, the perpetrator is much more protected than the victim.
For sure.
Are you able to tell us more about that and what that impact was like over the years?
Yes, so the perpetrator was married to someone in my mom's family. So I didn't see them for a super long time. It's been almost 20 years now because now we're in 2025 and this happened in November of 2005. That was really hard because I was really close with them. And I would also run into them sometimes and they would ignore me or be very cold or short. So that was really hurtful to keep seeing them and just be given the cold shoulder when I didn't do anything wrong. So it's so hard when you have integrity and you do the right thing, and then somebody treats you that way over something you didn't even do.
Are you able to talk about whether or not this impacted the relationship between you and your parents even?
Yes, it actually did a lot. I felt super betrayed, and I've been really lucky because we've done a lot of work and made a lot of progress on our relationships. But for years, even though eventually it felt like, okay, this was a long time ago, it would always just kind of come up. So when you sweep things under the rug and you don't really address them or heal from them, they have a way of just bubbling up and coming up to the surface. So a lot of arguments would turn into, well, this happened. So there was a lot of tension. I wasn't super open with them. I distanced myself from them a lot. And I never really got an apology until recently. My mom finally said that she really, really made a mistake and the wrong call. And, back then it wasn't talked about much and people were a lot more quiet about it. But I think now with the shift in society and also with more access to social media and people speaking out, there's much less of a tolerance for this. So it really took a lot. And I shared with her the video that John posted. And I told her at that point that I had reopened the case. And she was surprised. And it took a while for her to accept it. But in the end, she ended up being really supportive and she still is. So I'm lucky, but it's way overdue.
I love the perspective you have on this and the shift that you have seen, not only in your own family and relationships, but in society in general, that we are now working towards protecting victims much more than we were back in 2005, for example. And you mentioned the Me Too movement.
Yes.
And social media and how that all impacts. And even that video that you watched of John Stamos. Help me understand what it was that got you through from 2005 till now. What were your coping mechanisms? How were you able to deal with all of this?
I'm going to say the first 6 years were extremely difficult. And I really didn't have the best support at all. Watching Full House or funny TV shows that made me laugh, that was something, but not really exactly what I needed. It was a start, but I obviously needed much more help. In 2011, so 6 years after the incident, I started taking Zumba classes. It's a dance exercise class, and that really, really helped me with endorphins and healing, and it gave me so much joy, and I met so many amazing people. And also later that year, I met my third opinion gastroenterologist because I have Crohn's disease. I was diagnosed almost 2 years after the sexual assault, and even though she treats the digestive system, she was so kind and encouraging to me, and she was very supportive. And having that adult right there just show me so much kindness really helped me a lot, not just with my, not just physically, but also mentally. And then it was just very recently in the spring of 2023. So a few months before I saw John's video, I worked with a really amazing spiritual psychologist who works with the subconscious mind. And I really had been wanting to do that. I saw her in a documentary in 2019, and I saw what amazing stories she shared about people who had gone through traumatic situations. And because it was so long ago, a lot of this was deep into the subconscious mind. So I really needed somebody who knew how to dig deep and address things that were really buried under there. And this is so different than traditional therapy. I have tried talking to traditional therapists here and there, but nothing ever lasted or nothing was long-term and nothing really did a ton. Of course, they're going to acknowledge that's a situation, and I was able to definitely talk about my feelings, but nobody really offered any solutions other than accepting the problem and making new friendships since the family connections were lost. And of course, I did all that, but there was deeper work that needed to be done, and I don't even think I realized that this was possible until I worked with her, and I figured we would make some kind of progress, but I didn't know it was going to be this far, to the point where my confidence has increased. I don't tolerate any kind of nonsense from anybody anymore. And that also played a part in me having the courage to reopen the case. I don't think the counseling alone would have gotten me to do it, because it was 4 days after I saw John's video, but definitely having gone through the counseling, that definitely did help me as well.
Was the Crohn's disease something that was diagnosed after the sexual assault, or had you suffered from that pre-assault?
It was diagnosed almost 2 years after.
Then do you have some sense of belief or understanding that maybe the Crohn's was brought on by the trauma of the sexual assault?
I definitely think part of it was. There's a lot of research that shows that, but I don't think it was the only thing because I also did eat a lot of processed foods, unfortunately, throughout my whole childhood, which also has links to autoimmune diseases. So I think it was just the perfect storm of those two that led to that. And of course, some genetics as well. It could be, probably all three.
But certainly your feeling is that the sexual assault exacerbated that situation.
Oh, absolutely.
If it is something you're willing to talk about, tell us about that interconnection between the trauma and how it did exacerbate the physical and somatic situation that you were experiencing.
Of course. So I would often feel nauseous. It made me have unpleasant gastrointestinal symptoms, also more bathroom urgency and frequency, because when you're nervous, sometimes that happens. And then eventually it got so bad that I started bleeding and I'm like, okay, this is no longer from nerves or anxiety. Something's really wrong here. And that's when I ended up seeing a pediatric gastroenterologist because I was 17 at the time. She ended up diagnosing me, but I wasn't with her for super long because I turned 18 shortly after. She got me started on some treatment plan and got me to progress a little bit, but it was really, really my third opinion who put me into remission. So I was diagnosed 17 years ago and I've been in remission for almost 7 years now.
That's amazing. Congrats.
Thank you so much.
Are you able to talk to us then some about some different symptomology that may have been brought on by the trauma? There's a book I refer to quite often by Bessel van der Kolk, the psychologist, psychotherapist that has expertise in sexual assault issues. And he wrote a book called The Body Keeps the Score. Are you familiar with that book?
No, but I'd love to check it out. That sounds really good.
It is. It's an amazing book. It's quite long. And actually, he's even said, I didn't write this for the general public. It's more geared towards people who are in that field. But he is aware of the fact that a lot of people have gotten some great insights and understanding of their own trauma experience and how their symptoms are directly related to sexual assault or rape, and addresses those issues and helps give some explanation. Were there other physical symptoms that you think maybe were attributed? You said you had night terrors and intrusive nightmares. I'm sure you still have intrusive memories, things along those lines.
I used to shake a lot after it happened as well. And I used to shake in class a lot in high school, and I would always have to leave. And that was something that I'd never experienced in my life before. And just a feeling of, it was just very anxious feeling, like butterflies in the stomach, but really exacerbated. Not your typical, like, oh, I have a really hard test today kind of butterflies, but really extreme to the point where I couldn't even function. It would just happen out of nowhere. And sometimes I just didn't know why. Nothing would trigger it. Sometimes the conversation would, like, obviously health class talking about sexual assault. Yes, that's a very obvious, very clear example as to why. But other times I'd just be sitting there and it would just come out of nowhere. It took a while for that to stop. This happened when I was a sophomore, and then in the middle of my sophomore year, it didn't stop till the middle of my senior year. So that's a long time to have to go through that. A lot of people saw me leave the room, and luckily back then, people were pretty nice. Nowadays, there's a lot more, with the era we live in of social media and TikTok and people making fun of each other. People were pretty good. People told me years later, I always thought you had asthma. And I'm like, wow. So people did notice something was wrong. And then my senior year was also when I was diagnosed with Crohn's. So people at that point figured maybe she had a bathroom urgency. And sometimes I would as well. So I was dealing with kind of two things at that point.
Talk to us, if you could, about the evolution of how things evolved to the point where you got the courage and the strength and the mental process of actually reopening the case. And are you able to talk about the case at all at this point?
Yes, for sure. So I graduated college in 2013, started working 3 weeks later full time. And I think just with working, with each passing year, I developed more confidence. I think just with having a very fulfilling career and working around people, really strong leaders, I learned a lot from them. So that helped because when I felt like when I was a student, I really didn't have experience with work or with really doing anything significant where I had any confidence. I wasn't really involved in any activities where I was really leading anything. I was in the band, but that was with 150 other people. So I was never the star of a sports team or even on a sports team or anything with public speaking. And I've had to do a lot of that with work. just really, really good, examples. And then also meeting some confident friends, working with the spiritual counselor. That all led to that. But John's video was the final push. And I think, this era of social media and seeing other people speak out and a lot of activists and advocates, that also gave me the confidence to do it.
It sounds like what you're referring to is the experiences that you're talking about were cathartic, that you actually received some sort of emotional and psychological benefit from, for instance, John's video and from some of the other support that you were getting.
Absolutely.
Are you able to talk about where the case is now?
Yes, I would love to talk about that. And I would love to share this episode with some lawmakers in Connecticut and elected officials. And I'm in the process of working with someone in another state who has had great influence in changing rape and sexual assault laws, because I was very close to taking this case all the way criminally, and then I was stopped. So that was really frustrating. I reopened the case right away after seeing John's video, and I met with a detective, and right away I was like, wow, this person is phenomenal. And I had looked him up, and I had seen some of the amazing work he has done. There were some kids who were from Connecticut who were abducted and taken to Florida. He recovered them. So I knew that this was somebody who knew their stuff. And he did say it's not every day somebody comes forward this many years later and reopens a case, or sometimes people just report it for the first time. But he said the report from 2005 will help us. At least it's not like it wasn't reported at all where the person might deny it after all these years. We have some kind of stuff to work with. So he reinvestigated and he uncovered more information than in 2005, because that one really wasn't fully investigated because my parents were going to be dropping the charges. And also, I don't think that person who was investigating was that good or really gave it their all. I just felt like it was just whatever. And I did not like that. This detective was super dedicated, and he caught some minor details in more than one situation that gave him enough evidence to apply for an arrest warrant, which I was happy about. The perpetrator was not 100% honest with what happened, so our stories did not match. There was some, but not all. But he was able to see that it didn't add up, and I can't get into it too much, but he did figure that out. So I was thrilled. He said, I'm going to be applying for an arrest warrant. After spending months reinvestigating the situation and even speaking to people who weren't there, he would ask, because sometimes when all these years have passed, sometimes people will admit to others in their life, oh, hey, I did this all these years ago, never thinking it'll reopen. So he really went above and beyond, and I'm grateful for that. He just, whatever information he could get. The arrest warrant was not signed. This part really frustrates me. The statute of limitations is 48 years old in Connecticut. So we thought we were fine.
For the victim.
For the victim. So yes, so it's 30 years after you turn 18, no matter if you're 6 or 15 or 17. So it's just 30 years after you turn 18, regardless of when the assault occurred. So he told us that the prosecutor and state's attorney said that if you open the case already, which we did in 2005, when I was 15, you only have 5 years to reopen it. So I would have had till I was 20. If I had never reported it before, then it would have been fine and they would have arrested him. I called the prosecutor. I called the state's attorney. I spoke to so many people in the judicial system. And I also asked my private investigator, who has been involved in so many cases in this country, big ones. The school shooting in Sandy Hook here in Connecticut, school shootings in other states. He couldn't even find this anywhere. I said to the prosecutor and the state's attorney, can you show me where to find this? Can I come to the courthouse? Can you show me in writing? I said, because I'm reading the statute of limitations and I don't see it where you're telling me to look. They basically said that they can't show me what they're reading from, but they told me where to look. And I said, it's not here. And they said, well, it is what it is. And I said, my private investigator, who's familiar with laws in all 50 states, has also checked for this. And he really needs to be aware of a lot of the laws. And he said, that's what it is. And, they kind of set me in circles for a little bit, like just kind of dumping it off to another person, then to another person, then another person. So I'd have to call, and it was just, I kept saying, well, I called that person and then they told me to call you back. So really got nowhere with it. So I'm not clear if it's just for sexual assault cases or any criminal case that you only have 5 years to reopen it after you've opened it once. So and I don't even know if it's accurate or if they maybe made a mistake here. So I'm trying to figure that out, but I've finally been put in contact with the correct people. So I'm hoping that we can get somewhere with that. But it's really, really, really disheartening when you go through all that. You have the courage to reopen the case. The detective really finds more information with no physical evidence 18 years later. And then just to be told that. So, and everybody said to me, the state's attorney, the prosecutor, they said, oh, we agree with you. We have the evidence here. We just can't arrest him because the time has passed. So we agree with you, but it's the law. So what I had done was I tried to approach the matter in a civil way because that I had enough time within the statute of limitations. And the Freedom of Information Act in Connecticut, actually the local police department in Connecticut, didn't want to release the records to me. And they told me I had to file a dispute. Because he was never arrested, they said I can't have the police report. And I said, but that doesn't seem right. The only reason he wasn't arrested was because apparently some kind of statute expired. And the only reason why they don't release him is if they think the person is actually not guilty. And they very clearly thought he was. So I filed the dispute, and the Freedom of Information Act tried to work with them so that we wouldn't have to have a hearing. And they told them that they were not in compliance with the state law. And the police department records division still fought it. So we were supposed to have a hearing. 6 days before the hearing, the police department said, oh, we're just going to release the records to you. So they made me wait 6 months without us even having the hearing because the state of Connecticut assigned me a public defendant in the situation. And the public defendant basically told the police station that they were not in compliance with the state law, that they were going to lose. And there's times when he's 100% sure that the person requesting the records will win. There's times when he's 100% sure that the police department will win. And there's times when he's 50-50 or totally unsure. And he knew, and he showed them in writing what was wrong and why they were not in compliance. And they still fought it tooth and nail. So that made it really difficult too, because my civil suit lawyer didn't get the documents. He still agreed to work with me. And that was right there, just really kind of him. And then when he got the records, he said, wow, this is exactly like you said it. There's a lot of corroboration here. So he said, thank you for being so honest. He said, I get a lot of calls. He actually specializes in sexual abuse. And I had to get a lawyer out of state because the perpetrator moved out of state. So I got a civil suit lawyer there, and we tried to approach it, and we were unable to reach a settlement agreement. So what we decided to do was try and get the law flipped here in Connecticut, because I think with a criminal conviction, it'll be easier to do that without a trial than it will with just an arrest warrant.
With my background in law enforcement and knowledge of the law in most states, that makes perfect sense. I think you're on the right track. Yeah, that's really great. And I hope things work out for you, Rosa. This to me is not only critical to you, which I see. I'm so glad that you're here and talking about this, because not only is it critical to you, but I think it's so critical to many other victims and survivors who may be finding themselves in the same situation, whether they're in Connecticut or some other state. They may be facing some of the same roadblocks, the same diversions, the same cover-ups, the same hiding that is so common in these types of cases. It's great that you're speaking out about this.
Thank you. Yeah, the system is so broken.
What other aspects of this are you pursuing? You mentioned earlier that you want officials in Connecticut to hear this episode. Are there other types of things that you haven't addressed that you're working on to get that law changed? I've put you in touch with one of my prior guests on this show, and I think that's who you were alluding to earlier.
Yes.
And her name is Samantha. And
yes.
For those of you who are listening in my audience who want to know more about what Rosa is talking about in terms of hoping to get this Connecticut law changed, Samantha is on episode 10, and she is somebody who's not only got her own personal story of rape and sexual assault, but out of that experience, that inspired her to become an attorney. And she has worked ferociously in several different states, and it just so happens that Connecticut is one of them, that she has been successful in getting some statutes changed. What other things are going on maybe with you in terms of getting the word out about this situation?
Well, I'm trying to get the attention of elected officials and lawmakers, but I think a podcast episode will be a lot more powerful than just another email or letter, because they get hundreds of those a day, sometimes even thousands. So I don't know that it's going to get the same amount of priority. And also, Samantha does have some contacts here in Connecticut, and she's also an attorney rather than just a regular civilian like me. So I think she'll have more influence, but I am also trying on my end. But I really think the moves are going to be made in other ways, not just with just written emails and letters. I don't think that's going to be enough. I mean, it might if it reaches the right person or it strikes the right chord, but I don't want to just bank on that. I want to really, really get the word out and really have somebody experienced who's done this before.
Do you feel like that's somewhat therapeutic to you to be working in this aspect of your own personal experience?
Yes, absolutely. And I fully realize that this may not change anything, but at least I'm trying, because change doesn't happen by just standing on the sidelines. And I'll even be happy if they change it starting now and going forward. Even if I don't get anything out of it for my own self and nothing can change for me, I'm happy that going forward, people won't have to go through what I went through. And it's just a better experience for them.
Yeah, I think what you're talking about is if the law gets changed, they grandfather in cases from the past, as opposed to just saying, okay, from here on out, this is the way it's going to be.
Yes, exactly.
I think you're absolutely right. Grandfathering in situations from the past is critical. And I'm sure that's the hope for not only you, but if you do start working in this regard, I'm sure you'll find advocates and people in that state who agree with you that this should be retroactive to a certain date in the distant past.
Yes,
So,
and the
yeah,
laws
I'm
need to be more accessible to everybody, because right now it's crazy that police detectives don't have access to this information, and private investigators who work at the national level don't have access to this information. So that to me is really crazy.
Yeah, I agree. Rosa, I'm not real sure what you're aware of in terms of the neuroscience of trauma and how all this works with the brain, but you may have heard me talk in past episodes about how talking about explicit memory or things that you know occurred and you're able to talk about from your memory and remembering what you've reported and remembering the experience itself oftentimes activates implicit memory that you're not even sure you're there. As an example, I'm sure you've been in a conversation with somebody before and you're talking about something and all of a sudden you'll say, oh, and that reminds me, or, hey, I hadn't thought of this before, but now I'm remembering this happened too. Those are implicit memories that you didn't know were in your brain that are being activated by explicit memory and talking about the situation. That often occurs with guests on this show. In fact, it's a common neurobiological experience. Help me understand what you will do when this episode conversation is done and we hang up and you have the rest of your evening to go through, as well as tomorrow and the next week and maybe months into the future, as these implicit memories may be activated and come to the forefront of your thought process. What are you going to do with that? What is your support system like? And how are you going to be able to take care of yourself?
I've been really lucky that I have discussed this so many times in the last year and a half with the police detective, with my attorney, just in general with people who know how it's going. And I have really supportive friends and they're really compassionate and understanding, but I'm able to separate everything from my daily life. I live a really fulfilling life and I have a career now and I'm really not super affected the way I was. I've healed a lot, but I still want to try and get justice for the situation. And of course, do the right thing, get the person on the sex offender registry because it's important.
Yes. And I understand that's why you wanted to be on this podcast.
Yes.
And I'm really wanting to help you in that regard because you're absolutely right. This isn't just something you're going through. It's something that thousands of victims and survivors are suffering through and trying to cope with and take care of. So I think you're a great example. I really appreciate the fact that you've had the courage and strength to be here.
Thank you very much.
Rosa, is there anything that we haven't talked about that you would like to bring to light?
I think just one more thing. For me, it really shocks me that not only in 2005, but also in 2023, that people had the opportunity to give more information about what they knew and they chose not to. And I am such a person of integrity that if someone in my life even asked me to cover up for them, I wouldn't do it. And I think if someone does, you need to really re-examine yourself and think, is this somebody worth having in my life? Because I've noticed through the years that that was now 19 and a half years ago, my friendships, I have a few that have been there from the beginning, but a lot of them have changed. And if somebody does not have integrity, it's not someone I want to get super close with. That's huge for me. And I think it's everybody's responsibility, whether it's a stranger or a coworker or a family member, when someone is the victim of something, that you need to help in every way you can.
I think that's a great message. And I think that's a great note to close on.
Thank you so much.
Appreciate it. Rosa, I would love to be able to stay in touch with you and hear more about what goes on in the future. So maybe we could check back in 8 months or a year and see where things are at, not only with your case, but with you and your healing journey, because that's critical also.
Yes, absolutely.
I'd love to check back in with you. Stay in touch in the meantime.
Oh, yes.
I would really appreciate that.
I would too.
Great. Thank you again.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you again, Dave, for having me.
It's been my pleasure. We'll talk again.
Okay.
That does it for another episode of Sexual Assault Survivor Stories, the SAS podcast. Huge kudos to Rosa for having the strength and courage to be on this show with me. Her letter to John Stamos, as well as her message to state lawmakers in Connecticut and her communication to everyone else, deserves massive recognition and widespread notice. So please, if you're listening, forward this episode to all your family, friends, neighbors, and acquaintances. Let's help Rosa get this statute of limitations law changed in Connecticut. It's crucial to every victim and survivor of rape or sexual assault in that state. Thank you again for listening and spreading the word about this important podcast. You're helping bring justice to victims and survivors of rape and sexual assault. Please tune in again next week when I bring you another episode and guest whose story has the potential to help you and others heal from their traumatic experience. Please also remember to start by believing if someone reaches out to you to tell you their story of interpersonal violence, because we all know someone whose life has been impacted by rape or sexual assault. We'll see you next week.